visions and their insights. Speakers to share with us their visions and their insights into these areas. The format that we're going to use today is we're going to get each speaker will have 20 minutes to give their presentation, and at the end of those 3 presentations there will be time for questions. Okay? Our first speaker today is David Burgess. It says in Scripture that we do not do battle against flesh alone, but against powers and principalities. David Burgess is one man who spent much of his life doing just that, waging battles against powers and principalities, those who weigh down the oppressed. And some people, though, might think that David was doing nothing more than being a crazy man fighting windmills. But David has shown that when people unite, they can overcome the powers and principalities around us. David is most noted for his work in saving the Delmo farm labor homes, where he worked and lived for many years trying to wake up a nation to the plight of the farm labor families of the cotton-rich southeast Missouri. David is currently a pastor of 2 United Church of Christ parishes in downtown Newark, New Jersey. Don, Dave.
Thanks, Tom. Speaking only for myself, in my whole adult life, this is the most discouraging period politically. We're going to face a choice between Carter and Reagan. I don't need to go into the details. I think many of us who have been working in various social movements are very deeply discouraged and disheartened. And I think we're beginning to believe that only as we can work with people at the grassroots level is there any hope in this nation and internationally. And in the context of this pessimism, I speak today. My baptism of fire was an experience which began in 1945 in southeast Missouri. I was a sort of a jackleg UCC minister associated with the Southern Independent Farmers Union. I'd worked with migrants for 3 years in the South and South Jersey, 35 cents an hour. In southeast Missouri in 1939, as you all remember, in the middle of the winter, farm families were thrown out because of AAA payments made it more helpful for the farm owners to go to the day labor system rather than the sharecrop and tenant farmer system. And instead of taking their plight lying down, they parked at the side of the road under tents of the STFU. Mrs. Roosevelt heard about their plight. Within a matter of a year, under the magnificent leadership of Will Alexander of the Farm Security Administration, 10 farm labor home communities were built, about 650 homes. But the principalities and powers are working hard in Congress, Harry Byrd and other liberals like that. And within a matter of 4 years, partly pressured from the cotton planters of southeast, swamp-east Missouri, as we called it, the U.S. Congress passed a bill telling the FSA to liquidate. Just at the time of the death of FDR, the liquidation started. We had against us the Farm Bureau Federation, the local chambers of commerce, most of the church, but we had certain things going for us. Pete Hudgens, a good Alabaman, was deputy to Mr. Hancock, who was then the head of the FSA. Mr. Hancock was a perennial alcoholic and spent most of his days in Oxford, North Carolina. and nights too. And Pete Hudgens, good Alabaman, told us how to operate. We solicited money from all over the country. Marshall Field, a few other people like this. But the main problem was right there. Faith and trust, 7 black farm labor home communities, 3 white farm labor home communities. We raised from each family $100. This is very difficult. It's sort of a joke figure now, but it was very important. We got the Episcopal Church behind us, Bishop Scarlett of St. Louis. And to make a long story short, we won 9 of the 10 communities. We raised the equivalent of $90,000, half from the people, half from elsewhere. We bought the whole communities for $285,000. Within 5 years, they'd all been paid off at a rate of $10 per month per family. We lived with them. Now, there was lack of employment in these communities. The people had a slim future because of automation of cotton picking and cotton chopping. We had no support from Harry Truman because he bought his election in 1940 in southeast Missouri. And we continued, and the farm community survives, but in great difficulties. Now the church, I'll speak only of the Protestant because I know something about it, since the 1950s has neglected farm areas by and large. The reasons are simple. 85% of Americans now live in towns of 10,000 persons or more. In the 1960s and 1970s, the churches were concerned about civil rights, black power, the Vietnam question. That was one part of it. The other part is that the Protestant churches, at least since 1968, have grown increasingly conservative on the national level. There's increasing suspicion of local churches and state bodies of headquarters of the Protestant churches. Some Southern Baptists said, we're no longer the headquarters, we're the hindquarters of our denomination. In the Presbyterian Church, many of my friends were purged. And there is a growing conservatism, the holiness movement, folks that really are rural-oriented but are the victims of storefront preachers at times. Part of the weakness of the church is that in the protests of the 60s, both in and out of the church, there was a lack of any ideology. My own son was in the 68 Democratic Convention, was gassed, maced, and beaten by the Chicago police. He gave up politics after that. It's the oldest son. And many of the people that were in the Vietnam movement, church-related, went into sex and drugs, urban communes in Vermont, and various types of escapism. Part of the difficulty today in the church is that there's no structure on the campuses. There are one-shot campaigns for Cesar Chavez, for Cambodian relief, nuclear protests, but there are no sustaining organizations to keep college folks alive. And meantime, America has become homogenized. Atlanta is very much like New York. The questions of corporate control in Arkansas are also questions of corporate control in New Jersey. Now, religious groups just in the last couple of years are becoming aware that things are not right on the countryside. My own denomination, for the first time in almost 10 years at its synod, passed a resolution about the whole question of the future of the farm family and the future of rural areas. The family-sized farm since 1935 has decreased by 65%. The rise of corporate control. I mentioned tomatoes yesterday. But the whole question of the power of General Foods, of Procter & Gamble, of the fact that 50 food processing companies control most of America, and I think you know the story. I have been the spokesman in Big Business Day, which is largely a coalition of consumer groups and a few church groups and the better part of the labor movement. And I say better part because I was a CIO organizer for 8 years in the South. We haven't been able to raise a cent from any major Protestant denominations with the exception of the United Church of Christ and possibly the United Methodist Church early next month. The Presbyterians made a $500 contribution to the Energy Coalition of Labor last fall, and the phones began ringing off the hook from Houston and Dallas. And I was just informed last week, no money. Okay, why do I still have hope in the church in relationship to the movements that you and I are for? First, I think if you look at the Cesar Chavez movement, it was largely Catholic and Protestant ministers and churches that gave the initial money and support for this great movement. Bread for the World, now with 31,000 members, formed in 1973 in the wake of the Sahel and Ethiopian famines, has become an efficient lobby for food stamps, for building up a world grain reserve, for fighting malnutrition, and things like that. The Religious Task Force is one of the major lobbies, Interreligious Task Force, largely Protestant, in Washington, fighting for better legislation to do something about malnutrition, domestic and foreign. The In Fact movement on Nestle boycott has been partially successful. It has forced the World Health Organization and UNICEF, of which I've worked for 10 years, to come out against the whole infant formula method of feeding babies in third world countries. And many of the major Protestant denominations are boycotting officially the products not only of Nestle's but other people like that are making infant formulas and really killing babies abroad. And I say this after 21 years in Asia. I've seen it in Thailand. One of the most helpful movements from the right is the Sojourners movement in Washington. This is a group of seminarians which graduated from Chicago School of Religion in 1970 that have formed a commune in Washington and are putting out a magazine called Sojourners, which is, I would say, radically to the left socially, and I would say in the middle theologically. These are much more inspiring publications than the Christian Century and Christianity in Crisis. It speaks from a biblical basis about the threat of nuclear extinction. It speaks from a biblical basis about injustice on the land in the United States and abroad. There is increasing concern in certain church circles about the increasing power of corporations. The Interdenominational Committee on Corporate Responsibility of the National Council of Churches is doing very important work on trying to make boards more responsible. They're noting that 5 grain companies control 75 to 80% of the wheat in international trade. They noticed that 2 farm machinery companies control 60% of the farm machinery sold in the United States, and a large percentage sold abroad. They have seen the way cash crops shipped to the United States, sugarcane in the Dominican Republic, carnations in Colombia, have ruined the economy of these countries. These lands formerly used to feed ordinary people. They're now used to ship sugar, flowers, and other things to the United States. And this collaboration between the local elite and American multinational corporations is a fact. And I would say the churches are in the lead in pointing this out. Archbishop Romero was murdered last night in San Salvador. Murdered while giving the Mass. And I hope today we'll have a moment of silence for this grave deed, bad deed, and this great man who stood out against oppression and was murdered as a result. Yesterday. This is dramatic evidence of what I'm talking about. Now, theologically, I think we have to move on a new front. Basically, most of Protestantism is Calvinistic and Lutheran. It's based on the supposition that man was made and women were made to conquer and have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, the cattle, the earth, the soil, and all creeping things. Have dominion over, to exploit. There's been a tacit assumption, in Protestant theology at least, that the world was infinite in its possibilities and there were no limits of growth. We in the Protestant church are just beginning to understand that there has to be a new revolution in theology before people can honor the soil, that there are limits of growth, that half of the topsoil of the Mississippi Valley Basin has been lost since the Civil War. This is destruction. This is exploitation and something bad. By the end of this century and by the middle of the next century, the United States will not have most of the minerals necessary for industry at the rate of exploitation we're using, and this will also be true of developing countries in addition. We are destroying this earth. We are putting into the defense industry metals which are needed other places. There is increasing rather than decreasing misery in the third world. I say this after living in China, Thailand, Indonesia, and India for 21 years of my life. And the increasing misery is directly connected with the fact that we overeat and overconsume, and the fact that both political parties claim that there are no limits of growth. I think we have some tragic choices right before us. And unless there's a basic theological revolution emanating from seminaries and religious bodies and people outside of the church, I'm very pessimistic about the future. If you read Heilbronner's book on the choice before us, it's very simple. Do we try to maintain our standard of living at all costs? Will we send the young women and young men to save oil in the Persian Gulf while we waste it in the United States? This administration is not serious about solar energy, about prices, about interest rates, about the connection between the oil companies, the coal companies, the nuclear companies, the Trilateral Commission, and the Rockefeller family. Unless we can see these connections, unless we can see that Anderson and Bush, half of Carter's cabinet, are the creations in many ways of David Rockefeller, we cannot really understand the reality of corporate control. As the American Friends Service Committee said, the idea of sending young men and possibly women to kill and die for oil in the Middle East or in nuclear confrontation with the USSR is neither honorable nor workable. Therefore, brothers and sisters, I ask of you 2 or 3 things. First, I believe, and I think you believe, that God is on the side of the poor, particularly as we celebrate this Lenten season. Second, I think we have to re-examine our whole lifestyles and realize that when we overeat, other people starve. I think we have to reread Micah and Amos and Jeremiah and Isaiah, because these people spoke to the crisis on the land, which is the crisis in America today. We have to demand the redistribution of land. If you go to Bihar State, where there are 90 million people in India, and you see the Brahmins and the way they control the outcasts, the Harijans, and you say, there must be land control here. And then you go up into northeast Arkansas and see the Wilson Plantation or the King Ranch in Texas. And you say, who are we to speak to India? And therefore I say this in conclusion, because I've been warned my time's about up. These are perilous times which are both good and bad. Many of us have lost complete faith in both the Democratic and Republican parties, and yet we do not see a clear alternative, with the possible exception of the Citizens Party. We have to demand that the U.S. government is not on the course of stopping every liberation movement in the, say, the Muslim world. And it is set on that course now. I've seen what it means in Vietnam and Cambodia firsthand. The Kissinger connection, the Rockefeller connection, and the support of dictators over the years. We are paying the price now. I say, and I'm trying to live this in my own life and working in the slum areas of Newark, that the time has come to organize at the grassroots. There's mass discontent in this country. Between 1972 and 1977, I spoke on 120 campuses in the United States. And I knew that there is something going on underneath in many of these campuses that are not reported in the newspapers. In Newark, you can see the community movements and the way they're beginning to emerge slowly but steadily. You have seen them bought off by the government. You've seen them bought off by foundations and housebroken. That is the danger of any movement from the bottom, of having its leaders bought off fairly soon in the game by promises of advancement on a personal basis. And so I say, starting with this experience in Delmo, that we have to begin to build from the bottom, not only for the safety and future of our country, but also for the safety and future of the world at large. Thank you.
Our next speaker this morning will be Irene Munoz of the Sisters of Humility. Irene works with the Muscatine Migrant Committee in Muscatine, Iowa. Muscatine, Iowa has the largest migrant concentration probably in Iowa. Her work is specifically with health care services there. Irene?
Good morning. No, I suppose I received my baptism of fire when I became involved with farm workers. It was a revelation. As a sister, this is before Vatican II and the changes. I wore the religious habit, and I worked in a hospital, and I prayed for the poor and the sick and the dying, but I never really mixed with the poor, the sick, and the dying, the very poor. I had 3 meals, very nice meals. I'd go to sleep at night and clean sheets. Whenever they saw a sister getting on the bus, they always got the seat, the empty seat. If you were waiting to do your business in the bank, people's always let you in the front of the line. And on, all these beautiful things of the good nuns with the long habit, you know. Now they call us the damn nuns. That's what I mean when I got my baptism of fire working with farm workers. And I found out what the real world was all about, thanks to Pope John the 23rd. He was beautiful. He did really let the fresh air come into the windows, through the windows, and make us all smell and breathe what it's really like to be alive and feel good and go out and spread the good news of what Jesus has to say today. And be with those that are suffering and hurting and celebrating life. Well, I went to Muscatine, Iowa, and I found out what it is to work with farm workers. Found out the reality that the farm workers in Iowa, the majority are Chicanos, Mexican Americans. They're my people. I understand the culture, the customs. So it was just a baptism of fire, becoming involved with the farm workers. At that time in 1967, there were no migrant health and housing laws. Today we have a migrant health and housing law, but it's still not enforced adequately. They are still living in substandard conditions. Although, before 1967, the church's involvement was interesting. We had a migrant ministry. The churches, the Protestant churches and the Catholic churches came together because they saw the need. But the type of service they were offering, which they thought was good at that time, was kind of a Kool-Aid and cookie type of thing, to the camps. They sang songs, and we'd pray, and we'd talk about Jesus, But that was not enough. And then around 1967, the Catholic Church took a much more active role with the social doctrines of the church. They began the theology of liberation and of teaching about human dignity. And this is where I became involved in Muscatine. The presence of a sister, of a religious, in that community was very interesting. Many had never seen a sister without religious habit. So I was kind of a novelty at first. I was invited to a lot of things because it was just nice to see a sister without a habit. And they just thought it'd be a very, at that time, I guess I was very nice and thank you and this type of thing with a smile. But as I became more involved with farm workers and began to speak out in behalf of their issues and their causes, I became to be called a rebel, perhaps, and maybe one of those damn nuns. Anyway, in our struggle with the farm workers, it was interesting that when we go out to visit the migrant camps and you see the conditions that our people are still living in, and at that time they were even worse, and they continue to be worse, we were harassed by the growers. We had the sheriff on us because they did not want us to enter the camp because of, they thought we were trying to organize. Just recently, my sister, who also is a nun, was arrested for trespassing. She was not trespassing, she was delivering health services to the farm workers. She was exposing the grower of the substandard conditions that our people were living in, the farm workers. They were living in hog pens. And this was passed. This was passed by the Illinois Migrant Health and Housing Law. In our area, we cover the Illinois side also of the river. And we were exposing the hog homes, the hog houses that the farm workers were living in. And she was there to deliver medication to a family whose child was seen in the clinic that day. And the grower had her arrested, and she was taken to the Rock Island jail. And these harassments continually happen over and over. So it's a continual baptism of fire. And we continually speak out on farm workers. But what I think is very interesting is how farm workers have affected religion. That's how I see it here in the state of Iowa and the state of Illinois, perhaps, but much more in Iowa. They have affected religion. When farm workers come to the area, before we got very much into the social doctrine of the Gospels, farm workers, we provided camp masses in the camps, this type of thing, and we'd say to the farm workers, be patient, enduring, this type of thing. But now it's much more aggressive. The theology is of liberation. You are a person with dignity and respect. We will help you to fight these injustices. And so because of that, we have become much more involved in our community. We have a Bishop Spanish-speaking committee. This is formed of all Hispanics with a lot of emphasis on farm workers to provide services to them. We have now we have a lot of priests who have studied to become involved with the Hispanic ministry, and they are now ministering to the farm workers in the area. We now have influenced the churches to provide our own religious programs. We have masses in 3 or 4 locations throughout our area. And this is all because of the influence of the farm worker. And farm workers are now staying in our community. They are not going back into the farm worker cycle. They are staying into the community. We have a lot of people that are settling out. Before, when the families arrived, everyone was happy to see them because they were here for the harvest. And they'd say, well, then those dumb migrants will leave. But no, they're beginning to stay. And this is causing a lot of problems in the community. Farm workers are staying. They're finding better jobs. We're giving them vocational training. They're going on to get their GED, their college. So now they're staying in the communities. We now also, because of the farm workers' struggle, because of the farm workers in the state of Iowa, we have formed a Spanish-speaking People's Commission in the state of Iowa with a lot of emphasis on farm workers. And I really don't think a lot of these things would have happened if we had not had the farm workers here in the state. Farm workers have affected religion, they have affected education. We now have bilingual education for the farm workers in the state of Iowa. We have, in our community, we have bilingual educations from kindergarten to third grade. Children are being taught in their native language. We do not want our children to be illiterate in Spanish and in English. We have pushed for this. Child labor law, yes, we do have a child labor law, but it continues. Child labor has not been eradicated from the United States at all. We still have child labor that we must contend with. And we still see our children in and out of 10 or 12 schools trying to make the family survive. And when we had the child labor law, when we were lobbying for the child labor law, a lot of the families said, "Sister, you know, the more hands that are out there picking, the more money it's going to bring in." So we had to do a lot of teaching with the parents. And the growers, they weren't always that happy that the kids were getting their education, because, you know, the more education you get, the more you're going to know about these laws and regulations. So we had a battle over that child labor law. And the battle continues nationally. We do not have national child labor laws. If they're there, they're not enforced. We don't have adequate migrant health and housing laws. And if they're there, they're not enforced. And it's a vicious cycle over and over. I see some changes, but not enough, just not enough. And I think the church needs to be continually involved. When I say the church, I mean everyone out here. I think we need to get involved. We come to a conference, we listen to this, and then we go back to our everyday life. But we all can contribute to that change in some way, whether we're teachers, students, whatever profession we're in. Migrant farm workers, they're going to continue in the same substandard wages, substandard housing and living conditions, child labor conditions, and on and on and on. And the church needs to take a stand. That means all of us need to take a stand, a definite stand to give them better wages, better health care. The health care, that's another area. It's just unbelievable. We still have maternal deaths. You know, that's a hush-hush issue. Infant mortality, pesticide poisoning. 2 years ago, we had families that were out picking. There was a plane that came over and did aerial spraying. This is just 2 years ago, very close to us here. One of the women were pregnant. A lot of children out in the field. No re-entry laws, no warnings. You don't even know the name of the pesticide. And it's happening. All these conditions are happening, and I think in the years to come it's happening. And I begin to see more migrant farm workers coming into our area, a lot of new faces, and I think it's because of inflation, of the way the whole system is all set up, the whole economy. People are hurting. There's a lot of unemployment, and I see a lot of new faces in the fields. We usually have the same families that return to the growers year after year, but now I'm beginning to see a lot of new faces, and they're coming, and it's because of the economy. But I think the church's involvement is right there, right where they're hurting, in all these issues. We have a Crew Leader Registration Act. I don't know how well that's enforced nationally. Crew leaders are still bringing families to the different areas. I don't know if they're making the necessary stops. We've had families arrive very ill, women in labor, because the crew leader has not made the necessary stops. We have all these beautiful laws, so-called beautiful laws, but they're not being enforced. And I feel I am a sign of the church's presence, for better or for worse, in the community I'm working. And we're not having a pacifying theology now. It's just the theology of liberation. And we have priests that are very active and very vocal in our area. Our Spanish-speaking bishops committee is looking at all the farm worker issues. We're beginning to speak out much more, and we have in the past. The migrant health and housing law, I had to testify before that of the conditions I saw. I think that's the presence of the church there, the child labor law. But I think we have a long ways to go. And the conditions continue. We've had, along with the children being out, the child labor law, along with the children being out in the fields, we recently had a case of nightshade poisoning of a child out there eating a nightshade berry. And these abuses just continue and continue. And although I know you have all heard of Cesar Chavez and his struggle with the United Farm Worker, that's still continuing. We're still trying to boycott the red coach lettuce. When is all that struggle going to end? It's a continual struggle. And we as a church must be there to serve and work with the farm worker to overcome these injustices. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene. Away with pious references to patriotism and to prayer. As the naked child is born, let the truth lie warm and bare. If there's such a thing to tell, make it brief and write it plain. Words were meant to shed light, not cover it up again. These words were written by Don West, preacher, poet, educator, and probably say more about Don than anything else I might say. When most people start talking about retirement and taking it easy, Don and his wife Connie started out on a new adventure. In their later lives, Don and Connie created the Appalachian South Folklife Center in Pipestem, West Virginia. Their work has been to do nothing less than to give the people of the Appalachia South back their heritage and their identity as a people. Don and those who work with him at the center are trying to preserve and maintain the traditional values and cultures of a proud and caring people. So I'd like to introduce to you today Don West.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I've come quite a little piece to get here. I sometimes wonder whether it's worthwhile to come all the distance from West Virginia up here just to be able to meet with you for a very short time, but I'm very happy for the opportunity in any event. I have been asked to say something about what we're trying to do at the Appalachian South Folklife Center and something about that particular part of the country which has had a rather peculiar and unique relationship and history to the rest of the country. The Appalachian Mountain Country I'm speaking of, which covers a portion of 8 southern states, the southern part of it, and this is the portion that we're concerned about at the Folklife Center particularly. I would like to say that coming from the Appalachian South Folklife Center, let me just read you a little brief statement on our letterhead, which is a statement of our purpose. We say we are a universal Christian center in the Judeo-Christian tradition dedicated to a mountain heritage of freedom, self-respect, and independence with human dignity to the end that people of all races, faiths, nationalities may better understand one another's religion and culture and work and live together for peace, brotherhood, and plenty for all. This is a statement of our purpose on our letterhead. Now on this letter I have here, I have a very brief little quote, a current quote from the Charleston, West Virginia Gazette, which is our biggest newspaper, and it's dated February 9. We had a big freezing snow there in West Virginia at that period, and the title of the editorial was "A Poor Forsaken Boy." And it says, "In Mingo County, a 17-year-old boy lived alone in a tar paper shack without water or fuel for a coal-burning stove. In despair, he picked up a cinder block and threw it through the plate glass window of a service station and sat down and waited to be arrested so that he might be put in jail where he could keep warm." That's just recently in this, and Mingo County is a county that millions and millions of dollars in value go out on the trains every day in coal. Now, we in Appalachia have been traditionally a rural people. Even the coal mining people are living in the country. And we have been traditionally for a long, long period an area which has been pretty desperately, in desperate conditions and situations that you would hardly believe would exist still in the United States with all of our great wealth and all of this kind of thing. So I want to talk just a little bit, saying that a little bit more about the Folklife Center, and then what we try to teach, and I'll go back into the history of why we're trying to do this. We bring young people from the various parts of the Appalachian South, from North Georgia, Alabama, East Kentucky, Harlan and Bell counties, and other places, as well as West Virginia and others of these southern mountain states. We bring them in for periods of education, and we bring them from the poorest of the poor. And we try to help them to understand something about their heritage, because for so long we have been hillbillyized with that negative image of people, you know, who, well, the black people had the similar experience for a long, well, still to some extent, but not as great, because the black people got up on their feet a few years ago and began to demand a change of those kind of stereotypes and the conditions under which they were treated. But we still have our Appalachian people are still presented to the nation by way of such things as the Beverly Hillbilly type thing, the Green Acres, the Petticoat Junction, and until Al Cap passed on, the Dog Patch, Little Abner stereotypes. And so it's grown up in the country, not only in the stereotypes by the TVs and so on, but some of the great so-called scholars. Arnold Toynbee, the great English scholar, historian, referred to the mountain people of the South as barbarians in one of his books on history. He had made one trip over to Berea College, and on the basis of that short visit, he went back and wrote that the Appalachian people had descended into barbarism and so on and so forth. And a book came out not too long ago, University of North Carolina, referred to the mountain people as hillbilly racists. These names, of course, hillbilly, you know, redneck, clodhoppers, all these are names that are used, or phrases that are used in a derogatory manner to stereotype our people. Now, personally, I happen to be a hillbilly, a redneck, a white, a poor white, a cracker. I'm all of these. I come from a sharecropper's family in the state of Georgia. My father was always hoping that sometime he might be able to own a little spot of land, and he was not able. When I was in the 8th grade, I walked 6 miles to get to school and 6 miles back. And then my dad said if I could find a school I could work my way, he'd set me free. You know, it used to be that a boy stayed at home till he was 21. But I left home when I was 16, and I've never lived at home since then. I went to a school which was a missionary school. This school had been founded by a descendant of the old slavocracy of the South, and had a lot of its support from New England missionaries. And that school, I got expelled from this school. I was working my way through, and I got expelled when I was a senior. I was opposed to the showing of a movie which was called The Birth of a Nation. If you know anything about this, you know something about why I would have been opposed to it. You may wonder why a southern hillbilly, cracker, redneck and all would have been concerned about this. And this is what I'd like to get into the story. We have had here in these sessions, we've had a good bit of emphasis on history and historical background. And the Appalachian people, the mountain people of the South, the so-called hillbilly, has had, as I said a while ago, a peculiar history, a relationship to the rest of the country. In the first place, we were a people, and this is what we try to teach in our educational work there at the Folklife Center, The Folklife Center is an independent, nonprofit corporation carrying on education, as I've said, as well, somewhat similar to what we did. Years ago, in the early 1930s, I started a school in Tennessee called Highlander Folk School. And it's carrying on in the same kind of tradition that we began at Highlander. Now, we teach the kind of things that I'm going to say just a very few words about here. For example, the kind of people that first and originally settled in the mountains of the South were a people from, basically, from Scotland, from the Irish, the Welsh. They were a people that who had been in the old country at loggerheads with the established order. They'd been rebels in one way or another, contending for more freedom of religion and this kind of thing, political and so on. So when they came to the New World, they found the tidewater pretty well settled by the Cavalier element, and they pushed on into the frontier, which was Appalachia. And they sank roots in the mountains, and for generations, hardly anybody knew about them. I remember about the first reference I remember being reference to the mountain people was by Edgar Allan Poe, 1845. He refers to the wild men across the mountains. And generally, that was the way we were treated. There was very little internal improvement. Roads, schools, and so on practically didn't exist. I can remember up when I was doing my thesis at Vanderbilt University, I went to East Kentucky to do original research. And I rode a horse up creek beds and on trails. There were no automobiles or no roads that an automobile could pass on at that point in East Kentucky in the more remote mountain districts. Incidentally, I spent 3 months there, and I've heard a lot of rumors about mountain people they're always slipping around behind bushes to shoot strangers and all that kind of thing. But I had never been there before. I spent 3 months. I didn't pay for a single night's lodging, nor for a meal, nor feed for my horse for 3 months. And I stayed somewhere every night, and I ate my meals. Now, these people, before the Civil War, these were rural people. They were little farmers, little farmer people. They were not slave-holding people. Very, very few slaves were owned in the southern mountain country before the Civil War. Mingo County, West Virginia, McDowell County, West Virginia, for example. In 1850, there was not a single black person in McDowell County, West Virginia. Today it has the greatest per capita black population of any part of West Virginia, simply because during the period of the development of the unions in the coal mining area, the coal corporations, when our mountain miners would go out on strike trying to organize a union, they'd go down to Alabama and Georgia and bring in train loads of black people, telling them, we have good jobs for you up there in the coal mining, house for you to live in and so on, and bring them in and put them to work in the mines as an effort to break the strike. Incidentally, McDowell County, as the union movement grew, McDowell County, the first local of the Mine Workers Union, elected a black man as president, although the majority of the local was white. So what I'm saying here now is that although we've been presented as barbarians and as hillbilly racists, it ain't necessarily true. It's never been necessarily true. For example, there was a strong opposition to slavery among these little hill farm people. They had to do their own work. Not only did they have to compete economically with slave labor of the lowlands, as we refer to it, but they were discriminated against politically. You know, 3/5 of the slaves were counted for political representation in office. That meant that a few slaveholders who owned several hundred slaves, could get a representative, where hundreds and hundreds of hill people who didn't own a slave at all, it would take hundreds of them to offset just a few slaveholders. So it was a tough situation as far as politics were concerned. So our people developed a strong opposition. And the abolition movement to abolish slavery became early in the pioneer stage, its early beginnings was there in Appalachia. I don't know whether you know, but the first newspaper in America dedicated wholly to no other purpose than the abolition of chattel slavery was there in the southern mountains, the little town of Jonesboro over in the Cumberlands. And the first issue of that paper said, the whole purpose of this paper is to work for the abolition of the evil institution of chattel slavery. And from that it spread on. The manumission societies were strong. And from that it spread on to the Civil War period when Out of that area, now I'm speaking of a territory representing a portion of 8 southern states below the Mason-Dixon line, out of that area, reaching down to Georgia and Alabama, 700 miles below from the Mason-Dixon line, up to 300 miles wide, more men volunteered for the Union Army than would have been its draft quota had it been up here in Iowa or anywhere else above the Mason-Dixon line. They volunteered at the expense, knowing, that it was going to be an expensive thing, that their people would be persecuted as they were, and so on. So this is a portion of history that's been pretty well swept under the rugs in our country down there. Our people don't know it. The Underground Railroad came up through those mountains, and the farm people along those routes helped to hide the refugees and helped to conduct them on to other stations. They're noted and dramatic figures who were participants in this kind of activity. So I come from this kind of background. My grandfather, living in North Georgia, my grandfather had gone with the Union rather than with the Confederacy. Jasper, Georgia, a little county seat town in Pickens County, North Georgia, throughout the 4 years of Civil War, put the Union flag up over the courthouse every single day. The Union flag, not the Confederate flag. I spoke at the Jasper High School a few years ago. You know, there was not a single student in that school that knew this about his courthouse. The same building standing just 2 blocks away from the school. Not a single student knew that. They all thought they descended from the old slavocracy, and that their people had been in that tradition. This is what I mean when I say, our history has been wiped out, and we have been shut off from a knowledge of our history as mountain people, rural people. As I say, still, we are rural people. We don't have any big towns, any big cities in our state of West Virginia. So when the Civil War was over, we had a development there where the mines, it was discovered that we had rich deposits of coal. Entrepreneurs from outside came in, they bought up mineral rights for 25 and 50 cents an acre that had millions of dollars of value under it. One old farmer, for example, in East Kentucky in Letcher County, sold mineral rights on a 600-acre piece of ground that was it looked like so rugged and rough, it was good for nothing except to hold the world together. So, but underneath that, he didn't know what was underneath it, but this Boston corporation paid him 50 cents an acre, $300 for mineral rights on 600 acres. That Boston corporation netted $45 million on that one investment. Now, our people were put to work in the mines. They'd been living in these hillside patches trying to make a living. It was tough. They had a chance to make a little cash money. They went into the mines. They worked long hours, 18, 20 hours a day, dangerous working conditions. So they, for a long time, they endured that. They had to trade in the company store. There was no choice. And for a long time, they went along with this. Then they began to try to organize, and when they tried to organize, the corporations brought in professional gunmen, the Baldwin Fells Detective Agency, the Pinkertons, and so on, and they were beaten down with violence and brutality, arrested and put in jail, and murdered. I happen to have been an organizer during that period of the 30s, the early 30s in that period, and personally I've had I've been in more jails than I have fingers, and I've had some pretty ugly experiences that resulted from that kind of activity. And of course, having started out, as I said, in high school, getting expelled, later getting expelled from college when I was a senior, again, 1929, for leading the student strike. I spoke for the SDS over at Pine Hill, New York, a few years in the 60s when they had their conference there. And I mentioned this, some of those young fellows, in the 60s, we had a lot of, some of them were middle-class students and all. They seemed to have discovered everything from Marx to sex. So I spoke there, and they were surprised to hear that, that in 1929, students in southern colleges, universities were having strikes, and we shut classes down for 2 weeks. Incidentally, just about a month ago, I had an invitation from over at that university to come back to give a poetry reading. I happen to be a poet. We support our work at Pipes mainly by my poetry reading tours of New England, where I read at Yale, Harvard, Hartford College, New York, Connecticut, and many universities up there. But I was invited to come back to LMU, that's Lincoln Memorial over at Cumberland Gap, and I wrote, I couldn't go because I was scheduled to be in New England, and I wrote the president, I said, I appreciate your invitation, But incidentally, you know, your letter is the first official communication I've had from the university there since 1929. I'd gone home to my sick mother to see her, and I had a message from communication from the head of the university saying not to come back. I'd been expelled. Now, yours is the first official communication I've had since that one, and I expressed my appreciation. But I couldn't be there, but they had somebody else read my poetry and so on. So it's, you know, you get a little kick out of that kind of thing sometimes. I'm sorry, I wanted to, just by way of showing a little bit more about this Appalachian spirit, I wanted to read one or two things here. Well, I was thinking about here on this, in one of my books, I have an introduction in which I speak about education. I happen to have five university degrees. I got to college, incidentally. I got to college in early 1920s. I had a total of $1.65, no diploma. And I went and I got expelled there when I was a senior. Yes, I got something from schools, universities, Vanderbilt, Chicago University, Columbia, Oglethorpe, University of Georgia, Johns Hopkins, Maryland, European schools. But my best education has not been from classrooms and formal professors. My real education has been beaten into me by the everlasting toil and hunger I've seen, by the struggle in textile and coal mines and sharecroppers, where our people into the mines were told down from the hills with fair promises of a better life, by the hunger I've seen in the faces of sharecroppers' kids, by my own sister, wife of a sharecropper, dying young from overwork and worry. This was the best sources of my education. I wanted to read, maybe, if I can slip it in here, time to do that, I wanted to read just one or two poems here that indicate what a little more of this thing that I'm speaking of. I mentioned that I have been very controversial, but as I said to one of my students recently, I have never been ashamed of having been controversial. I would be ashamed had I lived my lifetime in my period of history and not have been controversial. And this is a poem I'm going to read. It's called Clodhopper. That's this old, you know, to us it's the same as to the black people using that ugly name to describe them. And incidentally, at our Folklife Center, if you look at this picture, this is a picture of our center. The only time, this is about a third black people, black kids, the only time we ever have lily white groups at our center is when, and we do have a lot of northern church groups coming down. They come down, we just finished with 55 just before I left to come up here. And the only time we ever have lily white groups is when these northern groups come down. Ours are always integrated. This one, Clodhopper. And